Do you think we should give it a couple more minutes for people to log in? Yeah.
Raise hand, yes, no, vote.
Christine, mic is open.
Mute.
Yeah, that's off. Okay. See, she's disabled it. She disabled it. It's already 26% participants. See, they have no pictures. Participants 26. Chat, you don't want chat. Reactions. Start video and mute.
What happens at the end? Did the video end, Victoria?
Yes.
Oh, I thought it was a long one. Okay, well, maybe we should get started. It's 3:05. We're expecting more people, but Tracy, you'll let them in the room if they show up in the waiting room.
Yes.
And I was just hearing a little bit of background noise, so I would just ask whoever isn't speaking to please mute yourself. And we will get started. Okay, I see we have a really nice group with us today. Welcome, everybody. My name is Faith Batt. I'm the Speaker Series Manager for Friends of the Book Raton Public Library, and we welcome you today. It's going to be a very entertaining session. And before we get started, and I will introduce our special guest speaker, I want to introduce Krista Mackey. and she's the chair of the adult programs. She's been on the board and doing great work for the library for about 15 years now. And she runs the speaker program and the music program and the art gallery and a lot of other great things. She just has a couple of announcements of upcoming things to share, and then I will come back and talk to you about today's program. Krista?
So hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
So I've got just a couple things to say. To remind you that we have another speaker series coming up in a month, and that's Rose Feinberg. We had scheduled her once before, but I think it was probably this coronavirus that got her that time. She's going to be talking about three of our favorite singers, Bette Midler, Carole King, and Barbra Streisand. So that's November 22nd. Don't forget, you can already register for it. And if you mess up the registration somehow, you can still be a walk-in because we will accept them, and you just use the meeting code and the password that you used today. We are using that for every one of these meetings so that nobody has to get all scrambled up. So just use today's meeting ID and password again. And if you screw up the registration, we'll still love to have you. So the other news that we're going to just remind you of is about the bookstore, which, as you know, is not yet open. And we are not going to open it until the beginning of the year. The city is strictly limiting the number of individual people who can work, and because of the virus, and it's not enough to stock the store. But we still are accepting donations on Tuesdays and Wednesdays until 2 in the afternoon, 4 boxes of books at a time. Drive up to the portico, ring the doorbell, and somebody will come help you. We are also selling books. If you have the Coastal Reads newsletter, you can either pick out a genre and look at what's been entered. Two of our best members are doing the work of getting the books listed and also putting together grab bags. So you can just get like 5 cookbooks if you're really in a mood of cooking. So that's being done by Victor and Ann for you. So those things are still going on. Keep in mind that on the first Tuesday of December, there is Giving Tuesday. And since our bookstore has not been open, we can certainly use your gifts. So keep that in mind. The first Tuesday of December, Giving Tuesday. And now I'm going to turn it over to Faith, who will show a brief 2.5-minute video that we've put together in celebration of the Friends' 30 years of helping the library. Thank you and welcome. Faith?
Zach, I'm going to share my screen.
Faith, would you like me to share the video?
I have it, but if you want to do it.
Yes, I'll do it. It's a little tricky with the audio.
Oh, okay. Everybody can, we can mute everybody.
Okay, here we go. You have to make the host to do it though, Faith.
Oh, okay. Well, I can share it. You want to do it, or should I do it?
If you do it, click the share computer audio at the bottom of the screen. When you do the share screen, there'll be a, go ahead, try it. hear it, but we don't see it.
No? Try that again. Well, that didn't work. Let's do it again. Take two. Is that good?
That's it.
Trying to get that off. Okay. Got out of it for some reason.
Okay, couple of, that was a great video. Thank you to, was it Joanne who produced that? Thank you. We have a great group of volunteers that work with the Friends to support the library. And I noticed we have Cindy Bloom is with us today. Cindy has been our president for the past 8 years. She's just handed over the reins to Tracy Wasserman. Still acting as the treasurer and chair of the civic outreach, and we all welcome and support Tracy as the new board president. She's been the secretary of the board for the past 6 years, and she handles all the social media and the website and a million other things. And she's here to help me today too. This is my first time hosting, so forgive me if I have any technical difficulties. This is new, and we'll do the best we can. So, in starting our program, I just want to say, please, if you're not asking questions, we're going to do questions at the end. So please mute yourself so you don't have any distractions or background noise. And we'll open it up for the last maybe 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. And if you have a question, please type it in the chat at the bottom of your screen and send it to me, Faith Bat. You don't have to type your whole question. What I'll do is I'll just mention the topic of your question and I'll call on you in the order that I get your questions, and then you can speak to Dr. Phillips yourself directly. And we are recording this, and so If you want to revisit it or tell your friends, it will be up on our website. Okay, so Martha Graham was known as the high priestess of modern dance in America and was referred to as the Picasso of modern dance. Although Graham claimed that she was not political, she and her company performed at the behest of the State Department on 5 continents during the administrations of 8 US presidents. From a White House performance for the Roosevelts in 1937 to a planned tour under George H.W. Bush to Eastern Europe in November 1989, noted scholar Dr. Victoria Phillips connects readers to the depths to which Graham and her company infiltrated the American propaganda machine. And we thank you all for joining us today as we welcome you all and we discuss the book, Phillips' new book, Martha Graham's Cold War, The Dance of American Diplomacy. And just a little bio before we get started. Victoria Phillips is the author, obviously, of Martha Graham's Cold War, The Dance of American Diplomacy, as I said.
Faith,
Yeah,
nobody can see you. You're getting chats up there.
nobody can see me.
There you are. You're
What?
back.
I'm
You're
back.
back.
I don't know what interrupted that, but I apologize. Okay.
Go into participants and mute everyone. Go into
Okay.
participants and mute everyone. That's why they can't see.
Oh, okay. Mute. There we go. Okay, how's that? Are we good now? Good? Okay.
Oh, you should be on speaker view.
How are we doing now? I see Tracy on my screen. I'm seeing Tracy on my screen when I go to speaker view.
She must be unmuted.
Can anybody hear me? Tracy, can you hear me?
Keep going. You're okay. Keep going.
I don't know why people can't hear me or can't see me.
I
Okay,
can hear you. I can hear you and see you.
okay, someone sees me. Okay, here we go. From the top, okay? Victoria Phillips is the author of Martha Graham's Cold War, The Dance of American Diplomacy, which explores the international political life of Martha Graham as she promoted the United States in over 30 nations for every presidential administration from Franklin D. Roosevelt to George H.W. Bush. Graham famously denied that her work was political, yet documents, oral histories, and even the dances themselves show a deep promotion of freedom and the constitutional principles of the United States. Joining her denial of modernism, missionary religiosity, feminism, the book explores how and why she performed these denials as a fundamental response to the Cold War, to promote seemingly apolitical messages. Her choreographic works, preeminence as a company leader, and dynamism as a performer both on and off stage made her an invaluable Cold War cultural export. As one star dancer from the early Cold War said to Victoria, "Never forget, Martha was a genius." Phillips is a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and director of the Cold War Archival Research Project. Her articles have appeared in such varied publications as the New York Times and American Communist History, Dance Chronicle, Ballet News, and Dance Research Journal. She has curated several public exhibitions in the United States and Europe. Phillips has lectured at renowned universities, colleges, high schools, and international institutes. At present, she serves as the chair of the SHAFR Task Force on Digital Resources and on the board of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, the European Institute at Columbia University, and the British Society of Dance Historians. She is on the editorial boards of American Communist History and Dance Chronicle. Her primary research is held at the Library of Congress as the Victoria Phillips Collection. So ladies and gentlemen, we at the Friends are proud to introduce you to today's special guest, all the way from across the pond, Dr. Victoria Phillips.
Thank
so much. And if anybody can't hear me, please let someone know in the chat. And I look forward to your questions. Also, feel free to put them in the chat as we go along and as they come up. I want to thank Krista and Tracy for having me, and thank all of you for attending. And that's in quotes. I was supposed to be with you physically in Boca, and I'm so sorry not to be able to travel back and forth. We live there part-time, and so I do hope that I see you all in the library at some point and at other events. So thank you so much for having me from across the pond. I'll speak, and during the speech or the talk, I'll also be showing video. Unfortunately, the hyperlinks within the PowerPoint broke. So you'll have to forgive me as I toggle back and forth on the screen. Bear with me. But I do think it's nice when we have this kind of time to show you some of the clips to know exactly what we're talking about. So I will share my screen. Here we are. So welcome to Martha Graham. A lot of people ask me, who was Martha Graham? And although all of you may know who Martha Graham is, it's an important place to start. I start there because one time I gave a talk in Paris, and I arrived at the airport, and the gentleman driving the cab into Paris wanted to speak English. And he said, "What are you here to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm here to," and I thought, he's not going to know who Martha Graham is. I said, "I'm here to talk about the Cold War." And he said, "What's that?" So I always like to start with Martha Graham to remind people, as Faith so beautifully did, that she was known as the Picasso of modern dance, the first lady of modern dance, and the mother of modern dance by many scholars. This is a photograph of a United States postage stamp. It was a series that included Alvin Ailey and Martha Graham and speaks to the importance of Graham to the nation. In addition, Graham was quite well known in her time as an icon, much like Jackie Kennedy Onassis and Marilyn Monroe and the Campbell's soup can. Andy Warhol did a series of lithographs for Martha Graham. This is Martha Graham in Lamentation. Martha Graham's Cold War, The Dance of American Diplomacy, claims that although Martha Graham said she was not political, she was not a feminist, she was not a missionary, and all sorts of other things that she claimed. Indeed, she was quite political, and she acted like a very strong woman on the global stage, a beautiful ambassadress. She did bring religious works in places where the religion was being used in the Cold War, very particularly to claim that America and the West were God-fearing and the Soviets were atheists. So there were many things that she said she was not, that she brought. One of my favorite quotes that I found early on is from an opera by Louis Armstrong and the Brubecks called The Real Ambassadors. And in one of the sections, they play a song with Louis Armstrong playing trumpet in the background about the cultural tours which these artists were on. And the lyrics go, "And just to stop internal mayhem, we dispatched Martha Graham. That's what we call cultural exchange. No commodity is quite so strange as this thing called cultural exchange." So the tour locations are staggering for somebody who said they were not political. Indeed, when I made a map of where Graham had gone, this is the map of the globe showing where Graham went. So she was quite global and argues for a global Cold War. So the locations, as we sense internal mayhem, in 1955-56, she went to what were known as the domino nations under Eisenhower. In 1957, she went to the Cold War hotspot, West Berlin. In 1962, under Kennedy, she went to Turkey and Greece. Again, important Cold War locations, West Germany, and then, of course, what the dancers called behind the Iron Curtain to Yugoslavia and Poland. In 1967, under Johnson, she went to Portugal and London. And here we see a planned tour fall apart, which is a part of this story as Martha Graham becomes older as a performer, and the work indeed becomes somewhat dated. And again, in 1968, she, under embassy support, there's a small tour to Mexico. In 1969-1970, she's expected to go to the USSR, but she refuses to retire from the stage and falls into an alcoholic stupor and indeed almost dies, but is reinvigorated and finds sobriety. And in 1974, planned under Nixon, although Martha Graham said she never worked for Nixon, Martha Graham went out under Gerald Ford. She, as working for Kissinger, really, who he and Nixon were trying to open up China, and of course they've got problems in Vietnam. She repeats the Eisenhower tour, and of course Richard Nixon was vice president under Eisenhower. She drops India and Pakistan, which have dropped off a bit from the mayhem list. But she adds Hong Kong, Taiwan, and closes in Vietnam 6 months before the city is taken by the North. In 1979, she goes on what the dancers call the Jimmy Carter Goodwill Tour, which repeats some of the important locations that would be a part of the Camp David Accords, Israel and Egypt, and she also goes to Jordan. Then in 1987, she goes to East Berlin with Ronald Reagan. He famously says during the 750th anniversary of Berlin, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," and Martha Graham's company performs in the East. And then under Bush, she is supposed to go to Moscow and St. Petersburg, Poland and Czechoslovakia. However, a funny thing happened and the wall fell. All right, let's see. Okay, so what's the premise of this? Socialist realism versus modernism. The Soviets had socialist modernism. The Americans, the Soviets had socialist realism. The Americans had modernism. We can see examples of each side by side. Jackson Pollock was exported by the State Department. And the idea was that it breeds free thinking. There is the immediate thought, anybody can do this, my child can do this. However, the idea was the painting has a life of its own and asks the viewer to think freely. In addition, ballet was paramount in the Soviet Union, and indeed, quote, Stalin loved toe dancing. American, again, a mother of modern dance, Isadora Duncan, interestingly, had really solidified her career in Soviet Russia. This was much unknown and appreciated by American scholars. Although she wrote works like I See America Dancing, this was because she had gone to the Soviet Union, founded a dance school, married a communist, and declared, I am red. So modern dance in the Soviet Union, early Soviet Union, where she performed for Lenin, was this Isadora Duncan technique. And later on, she's considered somewhat fat and not technically very good. The American promise is of a technically sophisticated modernism. Graham in the 1920s sees a Kandinsky painting and says, someday I will make a dance like that. And indeed, she makes Diversion of Angels, which was a key work on tour that speaks to the power of love with the woman in white, the purity of love, the woman in red, passion, and the woman in yellow, joy. This is a very complicated slide, which basically says, it makes the academic argument for the book, which is that modernism was brought freedom, individualism, and abstraction. Under individualism, we had free speech. Of course, you had to be apolitical in a democratic state. And what Graham used was stories from the Western tradition, the Western canon, Greek myth, Shakespeare and Freud, in order to bring this, this individualism and many of the ideas that she needed to bring for the Cold War. Freedom included gender, religion, and race, all shown in the composition of the Graham Company. It showed that the United States was a bastion of high art, sophistication, that it was cultured to combat the Soviet assertions that the United States was a bastion of hot dogs in Hollywood. Abstraction brought the idea of a universal, and Eisenhower's bid for hearts and minds, and claimed that the United States artists could express something fundamental, universal, truth, love, by accessing the heart and soul of mankind. Indeed, the early parts of the book argue that modern dance began in Germany, and the Japanese were quite interested in modern dance as well. While Mary Wigman, who was really what I consider to be the founder of modernism in dance, was performing in Germany, this is the kind of thing that Martha Graham was doing while she was training with Ruth St. Denis and Ted Shawn, which this does not look very modernist. And this is Graham with Dennis Shawn as Mary Wigman is establishing the modernist movement in Germany. And here's another piece that she choreographed herself. However, by 1930, Graham had shed the shackles of Orientalism and the like, and breaks through with a work called Lamentation. And I will briefly show you a clip from this. And this is a brief clip of Martha herself. And this is colored. So in Lamentation, what Graham starts to solidify is the idea of the contraction in her technique. Rather than the corseted ballet body with an inflexible torso, Graham develops this idea of the contraction based on breath, and each movement would be inspired by the pelvis. Nothing moved without the idea of the pelvis. moving. So an arm didn't move, a leg didn't move. And here we see the contraction inspired by the pain of weeping. So literally the contraction of the muscles because of the lament that this person is feeling. And here we see the body is literally abstracted and given angles by the use of cloth. It's going for a universal. In other words, the who, the where, the why, and the when have been stripped from this. All we know is the what, which is deep lament or grief. Graham then bridges out into what later becomes known as Americana. And she believes in order to say that the Europeans did not understand modernism, that the United States had to find its own modernism. She bridges out very much like Frederick Jackson Turner, and she goes to the frontier, literally visiting Taos, New Mexico, with the likes of Georgia O'Keeffe and many anthropologists. And it's a hotbed of powerful women in the West, Mabel Dodge Lewin and others. And she makes works with the idea that in order to find an American modernism, one has to dig into the land and the frontier, and she choreographs Primitive Mysteries in 1931, which is a tremendous hit. Meanwhile, of course, the United States is deep in depression, and the government for the first time funds art with the Works Progress Administration, and indeed they dabble in modern dance with the dance unit. And here we have one of the productions under Roosevelt, but that gets shut down in 1935 with some accusations that there are communists in the WPA, which is actually true. In 1935, President Roosevelt signed a bill establishing the American National Theater and Academy, which then gets revived under Eisenhower. The idea was to build a national theater. The United States was one of the few nations that was making a bid for a hegemonic place in the world that had no cultural ministry, no national theater. So this was part of what Roosevelt thought might be an interesting idea, but would also bring theater to the people. In 1936, Graham is invited by the Germans, again, as we remember, this is really the center of modernism, to perform at a festival before the 1936 Olympics. And as many of us know, this was an important spectacle for the Nazis and a much contested event. Mary Wigman, who we saw earlier, would be choreographing the opening events. We've seen recently with China the power of some of these events as spectacle. And Graham, to her credit, said that she would not attend and wrote a quite brilliant letter to Goebbels, the propaganda minister who had invited her, explaining that many in her company were Jewish and would not be welcomed, and that she could not in any way support the Nazi regime. In the United States, there were quotas that did not allow Jewish dancers into some larger dance companies, and Martha Graham had hired many of those Jewish dancers. In 1937, she's invited to the White House. She'd caught the eye because of some of these rather political actions, and she caught the eye of Eleanor Roosevelt, who invited her to perform her work Frontier, again, based very much on Frederick Jackson Turner, which she had choreographed in 1935. And here's a small This is Martha Graham speaking.
Frontier is also an old dance. Old, I mean in the sense of several years, quite a few years. It was done with Louis Horst, who is a very great factor in my life, and he wrote the music for this. The drums sound, the drums really of a man going to war. The girl is seeing a great landscape. untrammeled. It's very different from anything that is Puritan. It's not puritanical at all. It's the appetite for space, which is one of the characteristics of America. It's one of the things that has made us pioneers. And I always felt there's one little line, and I don't know from whom it comes, but it is, I take this puppet, which is myself, and I fling him against the sky. And I feel that that girl, and I felt it when I danced, that dance took the puppet, which was myself, and I flung it against the sky, because light is such a magical, magical thing. You see, a bird never flies into the dark who is built for the light.
So we can see here, this is Janet Elber in Frontier. This was made for television.
Martha Graham, una coreógrafa, bailarina y pedagoga estadounidense.
So we can see how, although apolitical as a modernist, Martha Graham very much spoke to the power of the American frontier, which was very attractive to the White House. She then went on to choreograph Appalachian Spring in 1944. Of course, this is during World War II. The Office of War Information had looked for dance as exports. Roosevelt had exported what would become New York City Ballet in 1941 to Latin America. And Appalachian Spring was commissioned by Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge and opened at the Library of Congress and put Graham on the map as something of potential interest. What happens is then dance scholars with the end of the war rewrite dance history and say that because the Nazis and because the Japanese had been fascist, the dance, the modern dance, the free dance could not possibly have come from those countries. More is the modern dance ascribable to the bright land of its birth, a land where freedom and democracy are ideals, where traditions of human decency prevail, a land where all races are learning to work out their destiny together, a land of great spaces and mighty projects. So here we see this is the perfect Cold War setup. This was written in 1949. And the first treatise on modern dance explaining what it was. So this is the perfect setup for the Cold War. It is universal, it's free, it tells of the human soul, and it's American. So this, Martha Graham, although Truman was not a fan of modern art, and indeed the State Department attempted to export some modern art under Truman, which did not go well. As a matter of fact, Truman wrote, "I don't pretend to be an artist or judge of art, but I am of the opinion that the so-called modern art is merely the vaporings of a half-baked, lazy people." Yet, he recognized Martha Graham as one of the great women in the United States at a luncheon. And here we see Martha Graham as Woman of the Year. Meanwhile, Truman was a fan of ballet. And he tapped what was then called American National Ballet Theater or National Ballet Theater, or many other names, which is what we now know as American Ballet Theater. And they went on tour with works such as Les Sylphides and Rodeo, showing that the United States was cultured and also telling stories of the frontier across Latin America and Europe. And this is a poster from Ballet Theater, American National Ballet Theater, which now is American Ballet Theater because Eisenhower asked them to change the name for touring purposes. Eisenhower comes into power and becomes what I think of as a propaganda master. He militarizes many of the cultural programs that Roosevelt has put into place and claims them as propaganda. The tours begin with Jose Limon going to Latin America, and then branch out. Martha Graham becomes the first modern dancer to be officially exported by ANTA, which is Roosevelt's operation, which Eisenhower deployed in order to get the tours out. The tour mechanisms, Martha Graham brings them all. Americana, the idea that the United States is cutting edge, it's a civilized nation, and she brings something called cultural convergences, which is a very difficult term these days, but I will explain what I mean. First, Americana, the redemptive power of the frontier. We've seen this with Appalachian Spring. We saw this as we walked in or zoomed in. The Preacher, this is Bertram Ross, who I actually studied with, Martha Graham, and Stuart Hodes, who's still alive. The Bride, this is Martha Graham as the bride. The Husbandman, this is Stuart Hodes. And this is a souvenir program from India, 1955, under Eisenhower, where we see the picture of Martha Graham and Stuart looking out, the husbandman over the frontier, Graham demurely down, and directly opposite is George Washington examining his tree. Freedom of religion. Eisenhower had put "In God We Trust" on money, put "In God We Trust." That was the official motto, and it went into onto paper money and into the Pledge of Allegiance. And this is again to fight against the Soviet atheists. So Martha Graham has the wandering preacher and his followers. Actually, going back, the followers are very important. These are the four women. These four women, the followers on the frontier, were played by Yuriko, who Martha Graham had taken out of an internment camp in 1941. Yuriko had been freed by Eleanor Roosevelt. Pearl Lang, who was Jewish and quite well connected to a communist husband, and Ethel Winter, who was of Mayflower stock. Later on, the frontier trope becomes known as the promised land, and frontiers take on new meanings as they do under Kennedy and other presidents. Racism was a huge problem for the United States during the Cold War. The Soviets didn't need much to point to the deep racial divide within the United States. And indeed, Martha Graham was thought of as one of this says I can move this. Consider this country's the best propaganda to date. Martha Graham with Dizzy Gillespie. And again, I use this slide to show that the word propaganda was very much used in the 1950s. In 1944, the pioneer woman is played by Helen McGehee. And on tour, it's played by Matt Tierney. Matt Tierney and Mary Hinkson were the first two African-Americans to be taken into any mainstream Broadway showing company. And they were extraordinary dancers. Mary played famously the woman in white in Diversion of Angels. Cutting edge art. As we saw, Martha Graham said, someday I will make a dance like that. And what we see is a technology of the modern body in works like Diversion of Angels. So we can imagine in the 1950s, Graham is taking this to Burma. She's taking this to India. She's taking this to Japan, and people cannot believe that dancers can do this. The bare feet, the acrobatics, yet the beautiful lines of the legs, almost balletic. So this was quite astonishing to people and audiences, and brings the idea that this is a civilized nation. Graham brought Night Journey, the story of Jocasta and Oedipus, Cave of the Heart, the story of Medea. And again, here is this idea of the technology of the body. There's the corps de ballet. The Soviets were touring their Bolshoi with great success, but Graham has her own chorus. And again, here we have Mary Hinkson, who was African-American. We have Yuriko, and we have Ethel, all in the same group, whereas the Soviets had one body multiplied many different times. Cultural convergences. This, of course, would in today's parlance be known as cultural appropriation, yet as we must understand that at the time, Edward Said had not written his work, Orientalism was not a term, and this idea of making a melting pot with your artistry was not frowned upon. So in Japan, Graham, all of the dances that Graham took to Asia had a set by Izumi Noguchi, who was Japanese American, and indeed dances were oftentimes publicized with just the set. This is a poster of Martha Graham in Japan, which looks nothing like the publicity that we usually see. Graham was a brilliant ambassadoress. And that was part of the reason I believe, and I argue, that she was taken out again and again on tour. She was just good at first at the cocktail parties, and then later in state dinners. She was often invited to the White House in meetings. She was the epitome of soft power. Here's a publicity photo of her in Japan, and we can see this wonderful staged but heartfelt photograph. This is the company on tour in India. Not only did the company, not only were they expected to dance, but they were also ambassadors, which I go into quite a bit in the book. What did they eat on Thanksgiving when they were offered pigeons? Cold War culture. This is the 1957 tour, and this brings me to some issues of architecture and dance. Martha Graham said that the two arts were allied. Graham goes to West Berlin, where the women are rebuilding the city. It's in terrible shape into the late 50s. In June 1953, there's a spectacular revolt which puts Berlin on the radar for the United States as a potential for stirring up trouble in the East. So this is East Berlin revolt. The Bolshoi goes to London in 1956. The United States has to do something about Europe. One of the things that we begin doing is building buildings and embassies in the modern style. And Eleanor Dulles, who is the sister of John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and Alan Dulles, who has become director of the Central Intelligence Agency, is also in the State Department and the only one of the siblings with a doctorate. She got her doctorate in economics from Harvard in 1927. And she is known as the mother of Berlin, where she works for the State Department in Berlin and builds Congress Hall. This is what I call the good old girls network. Eleanor Dulles is good friends with Clare Boothe Luce, the wife of Henry Luce, and the ambassador, and she had just retired as the ambassador to Italy, and she was a congresswoman, playwright, actress, and brings Clare Boothe Luce to the opening of Congress Hall. She also brings Martha Graham. And this is a picture of Martha Graham, always decked in her furs, arriving in Berlin. This is Eleanor Dulles with Martha. And Graham plays in Judith. She plays a solo called Judith at Congress Hall for the opening, which of course is a bit problematic for some in the audience. The idea is in 1957 that the story of Judith, which is the story of the Jewish heroine who decapitates the general to save her people, with a score written for Graham by Schumann, who had been banned by the Nazis. This did not go over as well as it might. The thought is that some in the audience were completely shocked by the score. Obviously, the messaging of denazification was quite severe. And there was very little applause for Graham. However, Mary Wigman, back to the beginning of the story, comes up on stage, hugs Graham, and there is this moment of unification of the West with Germany, and the audience rises to its feet. In addition to various the performances, here's Graham at a panel presentation with a gentleman looking a bit bored by the whole endeavor. And there are events that very much feature women. This is Mary Wigman, Martha Graham, and Agnes DeMille, who we saw as the choreographer for Rodeo. This is the opening ceremonies, and here we can see Martha Graham very much playing the ambassadress. However, there was some pushback against Congress Hall. It was supposed to be a benevolent gift by philanthropists. It was quite clear that this was a gift of the United States. And indeed, the house was called, the building was called Eleanor's Hat, after the pillbox hat that Eleanor Dulles often wore. Graham goes home and at this point is quite devastated. She had always been a good, solid drinker, which did her a great deal of good at cocktail parties. This was the period. The tours were known as the cocktail circuit of diplomacy at the State Department. But Graham comes home devastated about the reception for Judith and begins to drink heavily. She does finish Clytemnestra after returning, and it is the first 3-act ballet, and it's called a ballet, that is a modern dance, and she begins to tour. Kennedy picks her up. She also goes behind the Iron Curtain. And of course, what the dancers were quite worried about was what was going to happen when we landed in Greece with Greek myths. Well, indeed, it went over quite well. This is Graham with Jackie Kennedy Onassis. In Poland, the religious works were emphasized as the United States fought for some kind of revolt or resolution towards the West in Poland. And Graham is getting quite old. The tour reviews include Martha Graham looks as old as the Noguchi rock on which she sits. She choreographs Phaedra as a bid to be sexy, and it goes a bit too far. The House on Propaganda in the Cold War says that this work is far too sexy and attempts to have the State Department remove it from the tour. It doesn't work. Here's Martha Graham with her rock, the Noguchi sculpture, but she is getting old and completely refusing to tour. As we can understand, Martha Graham, as pictured here, did not go over well as the frontier bride. So she starts to get billed as forever modern, historically modern, but indeed the tours are not well received. Indeed, in Germany, when the embassy is approached about having Graham on another tour, concerning Miss Graham, they write to Washington, "No conversation is free of such words as turgid, bombastic, old-fashioned, etc." And the United States has other things: American Ballet Theater, Paul Taylor, New York City Ballet, Alvin Ailey, Alwyn Nicolai. Graham, they attempt to put Graham to pasture with an award, as often happens. George Balanchine in New York City Ballet go to Moscow. Jerome Robbins with works from musicals to ballets, and Alvin Ailey takes Moscow by storm. Paul Taylor, who had worked with Graham, now has his own company and is doing wonderful works. Merce Cunningham, who had played the preacher in Appalachian Spring, is now doing his own very modern works. And this is Graham after having an alcoholic breakdown, and she's recovering here after quitting dance in 1969. She begins drinking heavily. However, as the world is unfolding and crumbling, a great friend of hers is working at the State Department and convinces Nixon that as he is trying to open up China, that Martha Graham would be great. Nixon remembers Graham from the Eisenhower years, and a contract is signed. Graham has recovered, she's stopped drinking, and she's refashioned with many facelifts and called by the State Department, gloriously made to order, high level, and yet still associated with the youth. And this is this is the New York Times with Graham, with her now spectacularly trained dancers. Everything is changed as she goes back through Asia. This is Japan in the 1950s. This is what it looks like in the 1970s. This is Appalachian Spring in the 1950s. This is the publicity in the 1970s. However, the technique has taken off. This is Diversion of Angels in the 1950s, and we look at this unbelievable technique that challenges any Soviet ballerina. Race is still very important. So Mary Hinkson and Bertram Ross have played the couple in white in Diversion of Angels. And indeed, the idea of a mixed race couple portraying the purity of love continues to go on tour. Nixon resigns as they're planning this trip, but Graham has Henry Kissinger. Apparently the two were quite, they waltzed with each other, shall we say. This is actually, these figures may be quite familiar to you. And as it turns out, First Lady Betty Ford studied with Graham as a youth. So it all works out very well for Graham. Here, there's an entire chapter on Betty Ford and Martha Graham. Of course, they also, at this point, Betty Ford is actively drinking and they become great friends. And here's the technique absolutely taking off. And then for the Cold War, it becomes quite convenient when Nureyev defects and Nureyev goes to perform with Graham. This is a work that she created for him. She takes on this idea of the legendary, and this is Betty Ford with Graham and Nureyev. And here's Betty Ford dancing at the opening of this work. Ford gives Graham the Medal of Freedom and goes, and Janet Elber performs Frontier at the White House. Ford doesn't get in, but Jimmy Carter does. The Temple of Dendur has been flooded. It ends up at the Sackler wing at the Metropolitan Museum, and the Sacklers, as well as others, commission not only this building, but also Graham to do a work called Frescoes. This is sent on the Jimmy Carter Goodwill tour to Israel and Egypt. A new version of Judith is created for Israel. And again, Lamentation goes as the bringing American modernism, Appalachian Spring, Americana, and Frescoes, which had been choreographed for the Temple of Dendur. We can see this is quite racy and Orientalist to the T. Appalachian Spring, Legend of Judith. And this Graham's performance precedes a cultural agreement that takes place between the State of Israel and the Arab Republic of Egypt. Then, luckily for Martha, Baryshnikov defects, and here's from Nureyev that Martha is a good place to train. Here's a picture of Baryshnikov with Martha. And here they are with Liza Minnelli and Betty Ford at Studio 54. Those were the years. Baryshnikov takes over roles played by Merce Cunningham, and Ronald Reagan comes into office. Graham stages Appalachian Spring with the preacher played by Nureyev and the husband played by Baryshnikov. Wonderful Cold War stuff. Here's Baryshnikov. And all of these first ladies might not get along, but they all knew Graham. Here is Nancy Reagan with Graham and Ronald Reagan, and here is Ronald Reagan with Martha Graham. Indeed, there's a long series of letters between the two of them. Graham then goes to perform at the 750th anniversary of Berlin. She brings Night Journey, and here is Frontier, which also goes with an African-American dancer playing the pioneering woman. Reagan says, tear down this wall, and Graham goes back to the United States and promotes herself further to Bush with this lineup of Americana, including Baryshnikov in a work called American Document, which included Baryshnikov reciting portions from the Declaration of Independence. And the State Department says there's nothing better than a non-American playing an Americana on tour. And here's Baryshnikov taking over some of her old roles. And Martha Graham meets with Barbara Bush, promotes the tours. Baryshnikov said in an interview to me, I was not political. Dance artists often aren't. He said, I just said a few things for a gala. Graham proposes a tour of Americana to the Soviet Union and the Bloc nations, to the Bushes. They decide it's a good idea. Barbara is very much on board. However, her husband is not. But they do manage to plan a tour for Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. However, the riots begin. McDonald's enters, and it looks, the idea that Martha Graham might not be a great idea, with ideas of what was called Finlandization, that you don't want to promote the United States with Americana too heavily if things are falling apart on their own. And indeed, she's scheduled to go in November. She's pulled back about a month before we think, and the Berlin Wall falls. Of course, we have Madonna still with Martha. This is Madonna at Studio 54. So Graham is always wonderful at bringing in the contemporary. And she keeps all her ties to Jackie Kennedy Onassis. And again, Jackie Kennedy Onassis becomes her editor at Doubleday and publishes in 1991 Graham's autobiography, Blood Memory. Indeed, it came out days after her death. With the fall of the Soviet Union, Martha Graham passes away on April Fool's. In conclusion, although we may think that Martha Graham is lost in memory, indeed, this is a Google Doodle that was put out for her birthday just a few years ago. So with that, I will end the sharing. And I look forward to all questions.
Thank you so much, Victoria. That was amazing, groundbreaking, and just artistically and culturally so incredibly expressive and informative. And it just shows the universal language of art and music and dance, and how it just transcends all barriers and can impact history. And it was so interesting. I'm sure that people have questions. If anybody would like to ask a question, click on participants. I think this is the best way for us to do it, and just raise your little blue hand next to your name and I will call on you. as they come in order here. I have a question first from Tracy Wasserman. Can you just unmute yourself? There.
I think I did. Hi, that was great. I just wanted to ask you about the letter that Martha Graham wrote to the Nazi before the 1936 Olympics. Does that letter survive anywhere?
That's a great question. And indeed, one of the ways I got to this book, I had studied with Martha Graham, and I was at the school when the company left for the Jimmy Carter Goodwill Tour. And I hook, line, and sinker believed this was not political. I was just dancing, and that's what the dancers often told me. So when I went into the Graham archives, they had been closed with huge legal problems. Everyone was suing everybody else. Martha Graham is always Sturm und Drang, and everybody's fighting. There's tons of infighting. So everything had been closed down. The Librarian of Congress opened these archives using a legal loophole. And I always tell my students this, I was invited to be the first person in to see these papers. I had written the archivist a thank you note after doing some work at the Library of Congress, and she wrote me an email and said, no one else has ever written me a thank you note. I want you to be the first person in. Now, I had no intention about writing with Martha Graham. I had been at the school. I had danced with Bertram Ross, who played the preacher. I was done. But I said, this is a great opportunity. I'll go in. And bingo, in the archives, there was this letter in her scrapbook from Goebbels and her response with the seal, with the Nazi seal. There were letters from Eleanor Dulles, links to her with an invitation from George Kennan, known as the father of containment, with the State Department seal. Reports from the United States Information Agency. And I looked at this and I said, wait, this is really political. And that was the start of a 13-year venture. So yes, that's a long way of saying you can take a train to the Library of Congress and see that letter.
That's fantastic.
Thank you for that. Fascinating. Are there any more questions? There was so much information. I'm sure we're all just, it's sinking in. In the meantime, while people are thinking of their questions, maybe you'd like to share with us how people can obtain the book. I'm sure that people are going to want to read it. What's the best way for them to order the book?
Absolutely. You can order it through Oxford University Press. Of course, they would like that. It is available at the usual internet sites. It is available Kindle. They can also, I'll put it in the chat, I have a website, www.victoria/phillips.global. And on the website, you can also see work that I do at the London School of Economics. There are other lectures and radio shows. There's a contact me button. So somebody contacted me and said, my daughter loves Martha Graham. And during COVID, I don't know what to do. And so we did a Zoom chat and I sent her an autographed book. So I always love to speak to people and have personal chats.
Thank you. And so we will put that in the chat in case anybody missed that. And what about social media? Can people connect with you and follow you on Facebook, and tell us how to find you?
Yes, absolutely. I'm on Facebook. And I'm also on Instagram, but I don't really know how to use it. I have to put in a very special plug for Eugenia Zanova, who is my assistant, when she first came on board, she said, okay, and now you can blog. And I said, what's a blog? Is it kind of like a letter? So I do blog, I podcast, but this is all thanks to Eugenia. I did not have a Facebook page before last January.
Thank you. And thank you, Eugenia. I know you're with us today and appreciate your help in coordinating this great presentation. Are there any questions? Let's see. We have, Tracy, did you have another question?
Yeah, I did actually. When you were talking about Martha at that panel presentation, was it Congress Hall back in the 1950s? There was a gentleman who looked really bored. Do you know who that gentleman was?
Hold on, I'm trying to put this in the chat. All right.
Maybe any of the gentlemen would be, it would be cool to know who some of them were.
Some we can track, and it's absolutely fascinating because one of the things I didn't get into was the direct involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency in all of these operations. Until 1968, it is estimated by the historian of the Central Intelligence Agency that about 50% of funding for US foundations was given by the CIA. A huge number. There was something called the Rampart scandal in '68, which ended this officially. And we know about this through things like the Zhivago affair, Dr. Zhivago, and also Animal Farm. But the extent of, some people have gone as far as to say that the Central Intelligence Agency was the cultural ministry during the early Cold War. So, you know, a lot of the modern art, a lot of the modern dance was funded, literature, reviews, magazines, cartoons. I mean, it's magnificent. So, you know, he looked a little bit like some kind of clandestine fellow to me.
Yeah.
People you really can't follow, like George Kennan, who wrote the long telegram from Moscow in the 1940s, really defining the Cold War. He constantly comes in and out of this story. You know, he shows up in all sorts of strange Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation meetings with Henry Kissinger to plan psychological warfare because Graham was considered a part of this psychological warfare project. He then ends up in Yugoslavia where Graham ends up performing for him, although I figured out that he had the flu. So he didn't actually see her, but his wife did. You know, there are figures like this. Henry Kissinger weaves in and out of this. I had the opportunity to interview, well, I had the opportunity to meet Henry Kissinger, and I had just seen memos that he wrote about Graham. And I thought, you know, maybe he didn't really write them. This was before I had found all these pictures of Graham with him. You know, maybe somebody wrote it for him, and, you know, why would he care about Martha Graham? And I went up to him, I said, Dr. Kissinger, it's such an honor to meet you. And would you be willing to speak to me about the export of Martha Graham and your work with her? And he just looked at it and he said, you will tell me, and walked away. So I put that in the footnotes. I said, I can say what I want to say. So, you know, he clearly knew who she was. He clearly remembered, and he clearly wasn't going to speak about it. And so far, I haven't gotten a letter from him saying you're wrong. So, you know, there have been wonderful people. The Ford archive, the Betty Ford people have been amazing. Kennedy Onassis's daughter helped me try and find papers to connect them. The people involved with Roosevelt have been great. Eleanor Dulles' sister is still alive, and she's speaking to me. So, you know, there's been this remarkable coming together of really powerful women in the making of this book. Although Graham said, I am not a feminist. Georgia O'Keeffe said, I am not a feminist. So many of these very powerful women said, I am not a feminist, which is another fascinating part of the story.
Thank you.
Jonathan has a question.
Hi, Victoria. It's a wonderful talk. You know, the dance world, as we both know, is incredibly competitive, and I'm sure it was during Graham's time, the pioneers. I was just wondering, she seemed to have had a grasp on the corridors of power because of her relationships that you outlined. but I just wondered, were you aware that other dance companies were sort of competing for these very rare opportunities that were probably very well paid, and the few ways that any dance company from the United States could sort of get around the world during these times?
Thank you, Jonathan. Just to put in a plug for Jonathan Hollander and Battery Dance. This is one of the few companies that is still touring the globe to represent American dance. So thank you, Jonathan. Yes, and this is one of the cycles that I trace. So it was very competitive. So Lucia Chase actually went to Bryn Mawr with Eleanor Dulles. So she was known. ABT was picked up because they were in this power network. So there were these networks, and Graham was able to get herself in them. At first, in the 50s, in the early Cold War, the idea is there was something called trickle-down diplomacy. So the idea was if the leaders believed in the United States, it would trickle down to the rest of the population. So therefore, you had many companies, American Ballet Theater, Martha Graham, kind of the orchestras, the bigger the better, right? And at some point, particularly in the 60s, the idea, it becomes clear that maybe you want bottom-up diplomacy. And then there are also budget cuts. So the idea is, can you get more bang from your buck with individuals, with smaller companies, with people who who work in the streets, literally. So there is a big move, certainly by the 1970s, away from these large modern dance companies. The only good thing for Graham is that Jose Limon was very popular, and he passed away. And Alvin Ailey, of course, is still touring. Alvin Ailey really, took it, but he was a very special niche. Graham and Ailey were not going to give the same message, right? Alwyn Nicolai, long forgotten, was a very big player in this. Paul Taylor, obviously, but again, different messages. The Martha Graham Company had Martha Graham, right? She was eloquent. She was good with leaders. She knew the right fork at the dinner table, right? She really knew how to do it. I think it's significant that she died and the company hasn't toured since. I think that's absolutely right, and makes perfect sense to me.
But you're right that the budget cuts, that they're not sending any large companies overseas, and that's actually how Battery Dance has been able to do this work, is that we're so much smaller. We go with 7 people instead of 17 or 27 or 37. So, Alvin Ailey Dance Company, when they go abroad, they have 2 costume people. They have a makeup and hair person, et cetera, et cetera. So it became the trickle up, as you said, for us anyway.
Yeah, so in 1955, Bezabita Rothschild was the costume woman for Graham, which I think is perfect. I mean, there are all there's an entire story that has to do with Israel and Bezabita Rothschild that unfolds during this that I didn't have time to go into. But in the early Cold War, if you didn't send a big company, it was thought that the country was insulted. So, in Japan, when Martha Graham first arrived in 1955, there were all these newspaper battles because the Soviets sent a ballerina and a small troupe, a very famous ballerina, and used the Japanese dancers and orchestra to kind of fill in. Well, they didn't do very well, unfortunately, and it didn't look very good. And then Martha Graham comes in, and there were wildly exaggerated numbers about how many people she came, but they counted every toenail when they were counting the people. But that was part of, we think Japan is so important that we're sending this huge troupe, and it was appreciated in the press.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? We have a couple minutes left. If anybody has a question, please go to participants at the bottom and raise your little blue hand, or if you turn on your little video camera icon, you can just wave to me and I will call on you and open your microphone. I'm looking across everybody. I'm not seeing any questions right now. Let's see. Don't forget to look in your chat so that you have the information, how to follow Victoria and keep up with everything and order the book. And if there are no more questions, anybody, we have another minute.
Well, I'll take a minute just to say thank you so much. This was really a wonderful experience, and I look forward to greeting you all in person at some point in time.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and this was so informative, and I'm sure people are going to want to go to YouTube and look at some of the beautiful videos and archives that are up there. Thank you for sharing that with us, and we wish you all the best success with your book. The incredible amount of research, it's very impressive. And we look forward to meeting you in person when you're in Boca Raton, and maybe we can have you back again in a future season. We would love to have you.
Thank you. My next book is on Eleanor Dulles. So if I can get that done in less than 13 years, I look forward to seeing.
Well, we look forward to seeing that too and reading that. And please keep in touch with us and we'll keep following you. And I want to thank all of our members of our audience today and members of the Friends. We really count on your support. We look forward to seeing you in person again next year. But in the meantime, keep an eye on your emails for things going on and check our bocalibraryfriends.org website to see what's coming up. And we thank all of our volunteers for all their great work. And we hope to see you all next month. Thanks for joining us. And thank you again, Dr. Phillips. We really enjoyed that.
Thank you so much, Faith.
Thank you.
Thank you.